Welcome, warriors of the board. Today we unleash White's most brutal gambit, pure aggression from move 1. No mercy, just domination. Let's crush the competition. First, the Queen's Gambit is a solid and universal opening. It works from beginner to grandmaster level. Unlike e4, it offers strong central control and early queen protection of the d4 pawn. Therefore, it is impossible for your opponent to launch any early attacks against this central pawn or capture it quickly. Secondly, your king is very well protected. It has an extra bodyguard of pawns surrounding it, which makes it significantly safer. Additionally, thanks to the pawn on the d4 square, your opponent cannot easily play bishop to c5, as often happens in the Italian game. This makes it much more difficult for them to launch an early attack on your king. In fact, it's virtually impossible. All in all, playing pawn to d4 is a very solid and reliable choice. Later on, I'll show you how to make it more aggressive and dynamic if you're looking to spice things up. Now, what should black play here? Let me walk you through the ideas behind each move. I don't want you to try to memorize everything. That's not practical. But once you understand the purpose of each move, it all becomes natural and easy to play. So here, by playing pawn to d4, you're establishing control over the center of the board. Your next logical move is pawn to e4, and take full control of the center. If black isn't precise and plays too passively, you'll often succeed in doing just that, gaining a powerful grip on the board and putting pressure on your opponent to find accurate responses. If black wants to control the e4 square, they have two main options, d5 or knight f6. Both challenge your plan to play e4. At the amateur level, d5 is more common. After that, playing c4 gives us the Queen's Gambit. Now, why play c4 instead of a simple developing move? While standard development is fine, it doesn't put pressure on black's center. Playing e4 directly is almost impossible. Black controls it well. That's why we use c4 to challenge d5 indirectly. It may look like a pawn sacrifice, but it's actually a powerful strategic idea. Welcome to the Queen's Gambit. In reality, we're not actually sacrificing a pawn here. And with pawn shortages these days, we need to be frugal. This is a false gambit. If your opponent takes the bait, which is common at the amateur level, you simply play e3, preparing to recapture the pawn while gaining central control. If they stubbornly try to hold on to the pawn, they're walking into one of the most well-known Queen's Gambit traps. You play a 4 to undermine their pawn chain, and if they capture on a 4, it shows they've missed some key lessons on pawn structure. You'll eventually win back all the pawns and come out with a better position. Now, if your opponent tries to hold on to the pawn, it can lead to some funny twin traps. For example, if they play a 6 to defend it, after a few trades, they suddenly lose the rook on a 8. If instead they defend with the c pawn, trying to hold it that way, the same thing happens. The a8 rook falls again. And while the rook might complain that it did nothing wrong and life is unfair, well, that's chess. We'll move on to the classical line soon, but let's stick with the Queen's Gambit accepted for now. It's what you'll see most often at lower levels. I'd say this move is a mistake. It usually means your opponent doesn't fully understand the position. They see a free pawn and think it's the simplest way to resolve the tension. While the Queen's Gambit accepted can be a strong weapon even at the grandmaster level, beginners often misplay it because they mistakenly believe they're winning a pawn. If black plays knight f6 afterward, you simply recapture the pawn and gain a strong position, effectively tricking your opponent into giving up the center. Now you've claimed the center, while your opponent has almost nothing in return. If both sides develop normally from here, you'll end up with more space and control. And eventually, you might even push a 4 to dominate the board and keep your opponent on the back foot. If your opponent ever tries to play bishop to g4, there are several effective ways to deal with it. There's a famous story. When Mikhail Tal was a young boy just learning chess, he misunderstood the Queen's Gambit and believed he was supposed to sacrifice his queen. So, he played knight to a5, and after bishop takes d1, he finished the game in brilliant style. However, to be honest, that sacrifice wasn't technically sound. The correct and strategic way to respond is what we call the zigzag method. When your opponent goes right, you go left. So here, you play queen to b3, creating a powerful double attack. You are simultaneously targeting the pawn on b7, the knight on f6, and the pawn on f7. From this position, black is already in serious trouble. If black tries to play bishop takes f3, hoping to ruin your pawn structure by doubling your pawns, you can simply ignore that idea and go straight for the kill. Checkmate is on the horizon. Now we're stepping into one of the main lines, where black responds with a 6 to solidify their hold on the d5 pawn. Your best reply here is nc3. This not only increases the pressure on d5, but also lays the groundwork for a possible a4 advance, aiming for full central control. In response, black typically plays nf6, reinforcing their position in the center and preventing you from pushing e4 immediately. At this point, you have a couple of strong options, and your choice can shape the character of the game. The traditional main line continues with bg5, aiming for early piece activity and pinning the knight. However, playing nf3 is equally solid, and in practical terms, it often leads to more flexible and manageable positions. For most players, especially outside of top-level theory battles, nf3 tends to be the more reliable path. If you play bishop to g5 too early, most opponents will respond with bishop to e7, easily breaking the pin. Instead, first play knight to f3, a move you'll play anyway. Many opponents will then play bishop to b4, trying to pin your knight. Now bishop to g5 becomes much stronger, as they no longer have their dark-squared bishop to challenge the pin. You'll castle soon, so their bishop on b4 ends up passive and ineffective. When beginners play this, it usually comes from a misunderstanding of opening principles, and it's simply the wrong move. After you play bg5, they'll often make another mistake by capturing on c3. What they don't realize is that this helps you. It opens a semi-open file for your rook, strengthens your center, and they've wasted 2 moves accomplishing nothing, all to your advantage. If they find the pin annoying and try to break it, no problem. You just calmly slide your bishop back and keep the pressure. You still keep the pin in place. And if they go for g5, that actually works in your favor. It creates a long-term weakness and makes castling kingside much harder for black. The kingside becomes vulnerable, and later you can play h4 to target that pawn directly. At this point, black's position is already under pressure. You just continue with standard queen's gambit development, e3, bd3, and eventually h4 to break them down. If your opponent is more experienced, they may not fall into these traps and will simply castle. In that case, you play e3 to solidify the center and open lines for your bishop. If they try h6 to challenge the pin, you just slide the bishop back as usual, keeping the pressure. Meanwhile, whatever they do with their queenside pieces, your plan remains simple. Develop smoothly with bd3 and stay ahead. After that, you'll just continue with development and castle, no matter what black plays. For example, if they play nd7 to support their knight, there's a small detail worth noting. You could simply develop your bishop and castle, and that's completely fine. Your position remains solid. However, there's a slight drawback. If you bring your bishop out too early, black can capture on c4, forcing you to recapture with your bishop and essentially spending 2 moves to place it on c4 instead of 1. Then, after something like c5 and a trade, the position becomes more symmetrical and can lean toward drawish, unless of course your opponent blunders, which still happens. To avoid that, it's usually better to trade on d5 first, then develop your bishop to d3. This way, if black captures on c4 later, your bishop is already ideally placed and you don't lose a tempo. Continue with simple development. Play knight to f3, bishop to d3, and castle kingside. This setup is common in many queen's gambit lines, solid and efficient. Although the position looks equal, it's more comfortable for you. You've created a mild pin, while their bishop on b4 isn't very active. If they trade on c3, it favors you. In such positions, the bishop is generally stronger than the knight. Next, you can play queen to c2 to complete development, connect your rooks, and prepare for central or kingside play. Your knight can also maneuver to a strong outpost. Meanwhile, black struggles to develop their dark-squared bishop, which is blocked by their own pawns. Overall, you have a small but clear positional advantage.